Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Spider-Man No Way Home and the general interpretation of Spider-Man as portrayed by Tom Holland in the MCU. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Tom Holland's Spider-Man is not the Spider-Man as portrayed in the comic books or even any of the previous movie incarnations. He's very different. And the differences are very interesting to think about. In fact, analyzing the differences is a big part of why I wanted to make this video. I'm not really concerned with the debate over whether it is good or bad to have changed Spider-Man from the way he's portrayed in the comics. The nature of adaptation as a part of prose is very interesting and quite deep. I'm not going to try and tackle it here. What I do want to look at is the differences between and other Spider-Man portrayals that we see throughout the various media he's appeared in. Now, if you've listened to any discussion on this topic at all, you're probably aware already that the biggest difference is that there is no mention of Uncle Ben's death anywhere in the Holland Spider-Man's backstory. That's already a pretty big difference. It's true that we still see an evidence of a good family upbringing impacting the way Holland Spider-Man looks at the world. But with just May Parker there in the background, we are missing an important part of the motivation of the other Spider-Man portrayals. Now, you're going to hear a lot of people say that this version of Peter Parker has no loss in his background, and I'm not sure that's entirely true. After all, he is being raised by his aunt, not by his parents. And since MCU Peter Parker is introduced to us already as Spider-Man, we don't get his full backstory. We can assume that at the very least, the loss of Parker's parents is a big part of what motivates him. That kind of thing tends to shape your behavior after all. No, I think the difference that most people are keying in on is the source of Peter's loss. We don't know what happened to Peter's parents. Presumably, they died under some kind of normal circumstance like disease or mishap or some combination of them. I know in comic continuity, they died as secret agents, and that was adapted somewhat into the Amazing Spider-Man series. But really, it isn't that important what happened to Peter's parents. It does already establish him as a kid with a mark against him. He's an orphan, he's not being raised by his birth parents, and that's a sign that he's already been through some trauma already. Characterizing Uncle Ben as a source of loss in Peter's background really oversimplifies what kind of motivation Uncle Ben's death provides for Peter. You see, Uncle Ben didn't just die because Peter made a mistake or Peter made a bad decision. He died because Peter chose not to do the right, moral, altruistic thing in a moment of pressure. When he had the opportunity to apprehend a robber, he chose not to. That robber then killed Uncle Ben in an attempt to get a getaway car. Uncle Ben's death thus provides a very powerful negative motivation for Peter Parker to intervene in crime. Most versions of Peter Parker see a crime in progress and they wonder, if I don't intervene, is somebody else going to lose their Uncle Ben? And this then drives him to fight crime as Spider-Man. Tom Holland does not have this negative motivation. His only motivation is the positive affirmations of good values and good behavior given to him by society in general, by the example of the Avengers and the other superheroes he sees in the world, and of course by the upbringing he gets from his Aunt May. There's nothing wrong with this. That is a very good setup for a character, but it is a very different setup and motivation for a character than we typically see in the Spider-Man story. Tom Holland's Peter Parker is much closer to, say, Charlton Heston's Clark Kent than he is Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I enjoy Clark Kent and Superman as a hero in fiction. And honestly, I think that Marvel Comics could do better with more of those kind of straightforward, very simple and wholesome heroes in its repertoire. But I think it's important not to oversimplify the way the traditional Spider-Man is constructed. You cannot say that Tom Holland's Spider-Man is motivated in the same ways that the other incarnations of Spider-Man are. Most Spider-Men have both negative motivation in the death of Uncle Ben and positive motivation from all the other sources that Tom Holland's Spider-Man has those motivations. Taking away that negative motivation doesn't make Tom Holland's portrayal of Spider-Man better or worse than other portrayals of him, outside of a potential prose argument revolving around the linguistic nature of storytelling. But again, that's not the topic of this video. However, you can also just not say that because they are both heroic characters, they are therefore the same. It's like saying a fighter jet with one jet engine is the same as a fighter jet with two jet engines. Just because they fulfill the same role in the battlefield doesn't necessarily mean they are the same. In fact, there are a lot of very different engineering concerns that go into constructing a jet with one engine as opposed to one with two. They will also have different considerations to take into account if they take damage, or as you balance their payload, and so on and so forth. This analogy bears fruit very well when we look at storytelling. Consider Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. When his powers lapse, he does not feel as burdened by the responsibility to go out and prevent crime because, without the great power, his responsibility is lessened. When Peter Parker's ability to prevent bad things from happening is reduced, his compulsion to prevent bad things from happening is reduced because that negative drive is weakened. That negative drive came because he did not intervene in the case that led to Uncle Ben's death. Yes, he still has all of the positive drives to become a good person in the world, but with no unusual powers, he's not driven to do good in an unusual way. So he goes back to getting his degree and holding down a job and keeping up his friendships and in general making the world a better place in normal ways. He never tries to build his own robotic arms or his own chemical enhancements to give him superpowers. He just accepts that his role in the world has been somewhat reduced. Tom Holland's Spider-Man may not make that same conclusion if he loses his powers. After all, he's driven to be a superhero solely by the positive examples of people around him, some of whom have become superheroes with no greater assets at their disposal than he currently has. MCU Peter Parker may try and compensate for his lack of superpowers by building a technological power suit or by researching ways he could get them back through genetic engineering. He is far less likely to accept a return to the status quo because he is driven purely through altruism and not through guilt over failure to act. And this is just one example of how I think this difference in motivation for Holland's Spider-Man is going to result in different takes in stories as compared to other versions of Peter Parker. And I'm very concerned that if we do see these kinds of stories come up with the kind of very flat single aspect analysis we're currently seeing around the writing, we may get stories that really don't add up when compared to Peter Parker's motivations in the MCU. I'm particularly concerned that without a source of negative motivation to counterbalance negative feedback, and with all sources of positive feedback now removed from Spider-Man's story, we're going to see a very lopsided character develop, one who only deals with negative feedback and receives no new motivation for his actions at all. Of course, we can't really say for certain what kind of stories will come out based around the MCU Spider-Man or the Tom Holland Spider-Man if Sony just takes the license back entirely. So that's pure speculation at the moment. I think that the Tom Holland Spider-Man is a very fascinating look into the way characters change when their motivations are rebalanced in different ways. And again, I have no problem with the story we got in the home trilogy for Spider-Man in the MCU. I'm not trying to hate on the series or really say that it's good or bad in terms of the way it portrays Spider-Man's character. I'm just saying it has rebalanced his motivations, and that is going to result in very different character growth than we have seen in any other version of the character. And I hope people will be very careful with that, both in the way they write it and in the way they analyze it. Because if you are not careful in the way you write and analyze stories, they quickly become very flat. Given the excellent acting abilities we've seen from Tom Holland in this series, I think that would be a real shame because he has the chops to give us good performances for many years to come. But that's just my thoughts on the issue. Let me know what you think about Spider-Man's motivations down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there you can use as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.